Matt Robison, Beyond Politics. And today, what happens if this is the end of NATO? It's a question I really wanted to get into with Dan Perry. He's the former Mideast editor for the Associated Press. He's also been in charge of Europe. He's also been in charge of Africa. I think he's done the entire globe. He is deeply sourced and deeply knowledgeable about all things global. And he writes the outstanding Substack, Ask Questions Later, which I highly recommend. We wanted to get into the implications of the meltdown that Donald Trump is essentially forcing on our European allies, what that would mean as it spirals out into the future for containing Russia, for our trade relationships, our economy, and the struggle to keep democracy alive and healthy around the world. So that's what we're getting into today. We're still in this very irregular release schedule. We've got some really interesting conversations coming up, including with Bill Scher, the politics editor of Washington Monthly, on some really fascinating stuff that he's been working on recently, and some other great episodes coming up ahead. So keep subscribing, commenting, look for me on Substack. And with that, here's me and Dan Perry. All right, so Dan, here's the biggest question. Is NATO now in a death spiral?
It's obviously wounded because the U.S. is the most important part of NATO, and the U.S. now is at loggerheads with NATO over the biggest issue that NATO is dealing with, which is Ukraine. The U.S. is seemingly aligning with the biggest threat to the transatlantic alliance, which is Russia. And the U.S. is also sniping at a NATO member, Denmark, refusing to take off the table the seizure of Greenland by force. So, look, I mean, people talk about a death spiral. I don't know if it's a death spiral. It may not be fatal. It may be survivable. It may be a survivable form of cancer, like prostate cancer. It may not kill us. It may not kill NATO, but it's bad. It's definitely bad, and the alliance is in danger. But who knows? Maybe there are silver linings somehow.
Over the past weekend, the Turkish Premier Erdogan jailed his main opposition leader. It seems like the playing footsie with authoritarianism has gone into full, I don't know, I'm going to drop this gross metaphor now. Is that survivable? It's like if you have a family member who's kind of a little bit of a black sheep of the family, but they're still in the family, you love them, but then they go full crime lord. Can you keep the family together?
We gotta, because of the Incirlik Air Force Base, because Turkey is an important bridge to Asia, because Turkey is, I believe, the second largest country in NATO with 80-some million people, roughly the same as Germany, but I think slightly bigger. Look, it was meant to be an alliance of democracies, of course, allied against the Soviet Union and other non-democracies. And now we have a country in Turkey that is on a slippery slope from democracy to elected autocracy to fake democracy to full dictatorship. They haven't yet gone full dictatorship. They're sort of in the elected autocracy to fake democracy type area code, but they're headed there, and it's bad. And as long as Erdogan lives, I think that will be the situation. But of course, Turkey is salvageable. They're a little bit more like Poland. Poland almost had that happen, and then the opposition managed to get its act together and win an election. And it's not inconceivable that Erdogan will eventually lose an election to such a degree that he cannot finesse it and rig it and engineer a 50.1% victory. So Turkey's not gone yet, and I think the alliance can survive it, but of course it's awkward.
You write for Newsweek. I write for Newsweek. Our articles sometimes pass each other like ships in the night. My most recent one was titled, "The Deal Maker in Chief Just Sold Off America's National Security." And it brought up an argument about the threat that we face and that NATO faces from Russia. And it kind of brings up this question of what is NATO for these days? Because as you just alluded to, obviously it was constructed to be a hedge against the Warsaw Pact. And I made an argument in this article that even as the Cold War passed into history, we entered a new phase as the Soviet Union became the Russian Federation, and the Cold War became what I call the Deep War. And it's all outlined in a minority report from 2018 from the Democrats on the Senate Intelligence Committee. It outlines in massive detail, and the links are right there if you go to my article, that Putin has essentially picked up the mantle of the Cold War and is engaging on an ongoing attack on NATO countries, on the West. In the words of the report, he's engaged in a relentless assault to undermine democracy and the rule of law in Europe and the United States, Mr. Putin's Kremlin employs an asymmetric arsenal that includes military invasions, cyber attacks, disinformation, support for fringe political groups, and the weaponization of energy resources, organized crime, and corruption. Mr. Putin has made it a priority of his regime to attack the democracies of Europe and the United States and undermine the transatlantic alliance upon which Europe's peace and prosperity have depended for over 70 years. And you are obviously an expert on some of the proxy wars and destabilization that's happened throughout Europe. I'm thinking here of Armenia and Azerbaijan and some of the other emerging democracies, proto-democracies. So that's all a prelude to ask you, is NATO just as necessary now as it was 40 years ago in the Cold War?
I think so. It's a little bit different because the Soviet Union had ideology to drive it, right? So conceivably, they could get people to support communism in areas that were not geographically contiguous. And that made it more of a threat, a very nefarious threat, because it could be internal as well. Americans might become communists. That was a type of expansionism of the mind, if you will. This is very different. Putin is a nostalgist of the Soviet era, but not because of communism, rather because of Russian greatness. And therefore, it seems less, but it's actually, in a way, become possibly more because of the very things that you just said. They now stand for another idea, which isn't communism, but autocracy. Anna Applebaum wrote a great book called Autocracy, Inc., showing how all these countries that seemingly don't have a common idea, don't have a common geographical aspiration, do have a shared system that they want to export. And the way they export it is to undermine the democratic systems in the world, basically the NATO countries. And what they do in these countries is to support far-right populist movements that are very skeptical towards global cooperation, that are very skeptical towards liberalism. They pretend it's about progressivism, but it's really about liberalism. And they would like the entire world to be autocratic because autocracies that are nationalistic look inward and don't interfere with each other. The thing that offends them about NATO is that the idea was a global ideal. It was an idea that was an ideal, and the idea is infectious. It's quite possible that the reason why Putin is so angry at NATO expanding to Eastern Europe and to Ukraine, and by the way, I do agree that the Ukraine expansion idea was quite a provocation because Ukraine is a few miles from Moscow. So imagine the US accepting the Warsaw Pact in Ottawa. But putting that aside, the reason why they were so upset probably wasn't that they feared NATO invading them. Rather, it was that they feared the countries of those regions seeing how much of a better life it is under liberal democracy and under capitalism with a human face, social democracy, basically, which is what you have in Eastern Europe. And whereas maybe they could handle in Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, that was so close to them. And they're kind of right, it was so close to Russian culture, was so quasi-Russian itself, that to have that be a quote-unquote normal country, so visible in this era by social media and by just communications to the Russian people would have been a danger to the kleptocracy, to the kleptocratic autocracy that Putin is building. So yes, long story short, they're a danger, and they're an even bigger danger in some ways than before because they're interfering in elections. They probably gave us Trump. They gave Israel Netanyahu. They are propping up Orban. They gave Europe Brexit. I mean, all these elections are like 1 or 2%. It's amazing how almost everything is binary these days. And no matter what, it's like 51 to 49. So this interference is critical. Brexit won by less than 52%, badly hurt Europe. They want to hurt Europe because they want Europe to be divided into middle level and small countries that don't threaten Russia, not into one huge behemoth that does.
Let me read it back. So what you're saying is that under the Soviet Union, the Cold War was a war of systems and ideologies, but it was also a war of ideas. And as we've transitioned to what I call the deep war, the war of systems isn't necessarily still going on, but the war of ideas, the war of what are we fundamentally about, what are a set of values, and perhaps systems. Perhaps they want to support kleptocracies. We fundamentally want democracy. That war is still very much alive. The difference now is we're kind of in a position where we have to accept black sheep in the family like Turkey who are veering toward autocracy because it's the only way to hedge against kind of the kleptocratic Russia.
Well, and one other thing, and this is like the elephant in the room. The US is in not much of a position right now to lecture anyone else about autocracy and about a diminishment of its own of their own liberal democracy. Because the Trump administration, sad to say, even if you support some aspects of it, certainly stands for them, right? Like, does anyone doubt Trump would arrest his main political rival if he could under the US Constitution? I mean, lock her up. Does that sound familiar? The difference
Right,
is that
right, right, right.
Erdogan is further down that road, and so he actually could.
It goes right back to our mutual work for Newsweek. That article I just quoted was at the top of a feature that they call The Debate against Republican Senator Jim Banks for about a week there. You are currently leading the debate section on Newsweek. People should check that out. You're up against William Bennett and Alfredo Ortiz right now with your piece titled Trump's War on Education Department Undermines American Nationhood. And this is your point. This is your point, is that the role of the Department of Education is to promote an education in our system, in our fundamental values and beliefs as a country, that there should be some support for that's fundamental to a democracy because we're self-governing. And the kleptocracies, autocracies, they depend on an uninformed, uneducated electorate to kind of, it's too much for me to bother with. That's how Trump won, right? People who paid no attention favored Trump by 19 points. And people who pay a lot of attention to the news favored Kamala Harris by 6. So you're essentially making the case right now in terms of domestic focus and cuts to the Department of Education. This is really what undergirds the entire idea of NATO.
Look, all these autocracies certainly depend on an acquiescent and therefore almost certainly malinformed populace. The Department of Education is a complicated issue. They try to promote equality of opportunity, to enable standards to be the same, but they don't determine the curriculum as it does in other countries. The interesting thing is that when they attack the Department of Education in the US, they're doing so essentially as part of the Republican obsession with states' rights. Let every state do what it wants. And so if some states don't want to help disadvantaged areas have better schools, that's their right. And this goes back all the way to slavery days, of course. That's a dog whistle. But the interesting thing is, when you talk about states' rights, there is great irony there because the right wing that favors states' rights in most countries would be very nationalistic, like our
Right.
country is, and they talk all the time about how our country is great. But the reality is, they don't want it to operate as one country. They oppose the federal government to the point where they oppose the FBI. I mean, it's unbelievable because it's a total contradiction.
It's like the quote, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. J.D. Vance is a hobgoblin, and I mean that in every sense of the word. I mean, here's a guy with a major bug up his butt about Europe for no discernible reason. He goes and harangues them to their face about how screwed up and evil they are, how much he hates them. And then, as the recently revealed Signal exchange shows, in private, he's obsessed with how much he hates Europe. He doesn't want to do them any favors. And what it seems to boil down to is, in the same breath, he can praise the AfB in Germany and like these far-right parties.
More than praise them, he went and met with the leader, didn't meet with any other
with
leader.
the leader.
Weeks before the election.
And it's all this hyper...
recommending them.
Right.
And in Germany, the AfD is seen as neo-Nazi.
Right. And there are these hyper-nationalist right-wing groups that represent one kind of vision, and Mr. Hobgoblin here, who sees no inconsistency, is all states' rights when it comes to the US. It's truly mind-melting if you stop to think about it. But let's not stop too long, because
he wants to weaken Europe the way that Putin wants to weaken Europe. Because you know what, Europe, if it's combined into one country, has a GDP about the size of the US and a slightly larger population, and it becomes a major player. He would, I think that branch of the GOP, the MAGA branch, basically, sees a world that is Hobbesian, as they say, dog eat dog. You got 3 big dogs, China, Russia, and America, dividing the spoils roughly. And Europe is there to be divided, the way it was at Yalta, between the US and the Soviet Union. And let's just say the Europeans don't want to be anyone's territory to be carved up. And the more they are united, the more they are strong, the more they are a big economy that also has its common security strategy, the less likely it is that they can be a lapdog that way. Therefore, J.D. Vance and Putin, and probably Xi Jinping, disfavor it. And that is why they are giving succor and an aid and comfort to these far-right movements all over the continent that would disband the EU and turn the EU into a bunch of little countries at the mercy of bigger countries. That is their plan, and NATO stands in the way of that plan.
Let's talk about the point you were teeing up a moment ago. Let's just envision, let's say we are in a bit of a death spiral. Really could be. Let's say the future of NATO is a much more arm's length relationship with the United States. It's essentially greater Europe, and there's some role, but it's pretty attenuated for the United States. What does that look like? How should we think about that?
I would argue this weakens the Americans. All right. America gets a huge amount of soft and hard power and alliances and bases all over Europe without the need for colonization, without the need for occupation. It's all completely voluntary, and it's fairly cheap, by the way. There's some trickery going on with the numbers. You'll hear Republicans saying, "Oh, we contribute 70% of NATO." The word for that is bullshit. All right. The U.S. expense for NATO is about 1/6 of NATO's expenses. That's it. Now, it's disproportionate. Europe should pay more, but it's not 70%. The way you get to 70% is that the U.S. defense budget, which is pushing $1 trillion, but that's not to do with Europe. That's because the U.S. has bases in Qatar and warships off the South China Sea, and it just has the world's biggest military by far in terms of expenses. So it's irrelevant. Moreover, the sum I'm talking about, that is 1/6 of the NATO budget, is small potatoes. It's 0.1% of the US military budget. I mean, it's nothing. It's true that the Europeans should spend more, but it's analogous to like two mega millionaires arguing over a bar bill that's $100, and one of them pays $90. And yeah, it's a ripoff, but it's completely irrelevant. And this is being sold to the American people as a monumental ripoff, and it's no good, and the U.S. is being taken advantage of. The U.S. has a forward base all over Europe, across an ocean, which, as a global military power, has tremendous value, much more than a few $100 million.
Trump famously took a briefing in the first administration, this was circa 2017, where he questioned the need for bases in South Korea, for example. And he famously asked as part of that, what do we get out of it? As if there's sort of like a monetary value. Like, what are we extracting from them in terms of trade concessions or, I don't know, minerals?
Well, it's ironic because he's now trying to extract rare minerals.
Right, exactly.
That he's
but
helping out.
That's the terms
that's one way to look at it.
Yeah, no, that's exactly how he thinks about it is. And he doesn't see that value.
The U.S. is a great world power, and it's an empire, much as previous empires were. But more than other empires throughout history, it stands for an idea that means something to the American people. And I think it means something to free people everywhere. So when we have bases, when we have troops in South Korea, that is to prevent the expansion of the communist dictatorship North Korea into a democratic part of Europe. We are the global leaders of the democratic world. And to Trump, that seems to mean nothing. I mean, when he says, what do we get out of helping Ukraine? You prevent despotism from expanding to Ukraine, and you shore up your status as a leader of the democratic world. Now, I would argue that this has benefits aplenty for the U.S. It makes you into a global power, and there are various ways in which that attaches to material benefits as well. But if the U.S. doesn't want to be a leader of the free world, then that is, I suppose, its prerogative. It's very sad for lovers of freedom. I would think that is very sad for people who care about what America once stood for. And it will probably make America a less meaningful country in the world and will be bad for other free countries because the U.S. has carried more than its share of the burden. That's true. For Europe, it would mean a very immediate, clear, and present imperative to shore up their collective strategic alliance and build up their defensive military power. And they're doing that right now. I mean, Germany is involved in borrowing essentially about €1 trillion for that purpose alone. But the thing is, they're very much lagging behind the U.S. on a tech side.
So,
and also
on that, might not Donald Trump have a point here? I mean, sometimes he does insane things that have a kernel of truth in them, like his invoking Title 42 on the border, shutting down the border. When Biden came into office, turns out he was like, there's some upside here. Let's keep this going for a little while. And I mean, isn't it the case that there's some truth in the core of what Trump is saying and doing here about how Europe needs to take more responsibility for its own defense?
Yes. I once realized the thing about a great leader sometimes in certain kinds of societies or companies is that they're not afraid to sound like an idiot saying stupid stuff that has a purpose. Now, I must not be a great leader because I have trouble getting up and saying in public and saying 2 plus 2 is 5. But you're absolutely right. There are cases where if you get up in public and say 2 plus 2 is 5, that will have a positive effect.
Or can
And
we inject cleaners into our bloodstream to get rid of COVID? That kind of brilliance.
I mean, I don't know if that had a positive effect, but yeah. Look, and by the way, not everything the administration does is stupid. And sometimes good things happen even without the need to say stupid things in public. He's right about immigration and the Mexico border, I think. And the Democrats had a weak policy there, and it hurt them. I mean, much of the reason that NATO is now being pummeled is because the Democrats bobbled the ball on immigration and got all mixed up with people who think that it's somehow wrong to police your borders, which is a maniacally stupid thing to think. But that thing belongs on the left of American politics and not the right. Look, yes, Europe needed to focus on defense a little bit more. The US was paying too much of that small barbell. And if this shocks them into a lesser financial dependency, that's great. If, moreover, it compels them to close the tech gap and a military strategy gap with the US, that's not a bad thing. It would, if this turns out to be prostate cancer, not pancreatic cancer, and we survive the Trump years, and NATO survives the Trump years, it'll be stronger alliance
Is
because
that the
the
upside here?
European countries will be better allies and stronger allies. By the way, just as one example, the U.S. is leagues ahead of them in battleground tactics and coordination between
Ooh.
air and ground forces. The Europeans and Russians, by the way, are still fighting with World War II levels of coordination, and the U.S. is way ahead. Perhaps the only other country that comes even close is Israel, and now maybe a little bit Ukraine, but with the help of the U.S. If the
With the
U.S.
help of
pulled out,
Starlink and Elon Musk, which
if
is a
all
little
that,
scary.
if Starlink ended, and U.S. and other munitions ended, and U.S. coordination and guidance and intel ended, especially those last three things, the Europeans would have a tough time replacing it in the short term. So maybe in the mid to long term, if this compels them to get their shit together, basically, when it comes to defense, then they'll be better allies for a U.S. that is back in the saddle of NATO. But it certainly is a danger, nonetheless. So there's an analogy to what Trump did in the Middle East. He said some crazy nonsense about how the U.S. is going to buy Gaza, own Gaza, and all 2 million and some Gazans going to go somewhere else. Now that's just bullshit. But here's the thing: it compelled the Arab nations that for way too long had goaded the Palestinians into impossible positions in peace talks and into sticking to dreams that are not realistic and essentially making the peace process impossible with their maximalism. The Arab nations that did that and also washed their hands of the Palestinians are suddenly much more engaged, much more reasonable, trying to come up with an alternate plan to Trump's ridiculous one. So you could say, had Trump not sort of took one for the team by going out in public and looking like such an idiot, then this good result would not have happened. It's conceivable that some analog of that could be the case with NATO. I don't deny.
There's an academic literature around this in negotiations when it comes to
Sure.
having a partner who is unstable, unpredictable, and who you can't rein in is a major asset when you're going to the table and you're saying, hey,
Absolutely.
look, I'm with you, my friend Dan. I want to work with you here, but I don't know what my crazy partner is going to do. And we've already seen this play out when Biden
Absolutely.
and the incoming
Yeah.
Trump administration worked together to impose a temporary ceasefire between
Absolutely.
Israel and Gaza. And it was the fact that Biden could say, I mean, this has been widely acknowledged, the fact that Biden could say, hey, look, this Trump guy, I don't know what he's going to do. It's like in Bull Durham where Crash Davis tells the catcher, I don't know where the next pitch is going to go. I would back off if I were you. Turns out that kind of thing can work. But what I
Absolutely
hear
true.
you saying is
But it's very
there's
mafiotic. Like
right.
this is Muggsy, and he doesn't like you not paying protection for your store. So I don't know what he's gonna do,
I don't know what
but
he's going to do.
it might not be so pleasant. I mean, sure, it's a mafia tactic, but you can look at it
But
academically. You could say
sometimes it works.
there's something called the Overton window, like
Right.
the range of possibilities of what's on a table for discussion. Trump very much widens the Overton window, and he
Yeah.
puts stuff on the table for discussion, like the U.S. leaving NATO, that reshuffles the deck really, and that makes sometimes a better outcome attainable more quickly. I don't deny it, but if the U.S. were really to pull out of NATO because of the money thing, that would be a dumbass move, and it would be terrible for Europe, terrible for the world, and a gift on a platter to
Right.
autocrats everywhere like Xi and like Putin. Now, the
So
America I love
we're
doesn't
playing with
want Putin
fire.
and Xi to be given a gift,
Yeah.
right?
So what you're saying is we're playing with fire. The rhetoric is dangerous and it sounds unhinged, but we should not lose sight of the fact that there is an upside here. It could work. It could work. And NATO and our transatlantic partnership and our hedge against the deep war and everything Putin is trying to pull off by spreading kleptocracy and autocracy around the world, this could work. And this is where I want to land with you. Give me your kind of best creative thinking and project out 5 to 10 years. Give me best case scenario and worst case scenario. What does all of this look like in a few years? What's the rosy scenario and what is the not?
The rosy scenario is pretty easy. All these unintended consequences or brilliantly engineered consequences we're talking about, a reasonable Arab Middle East, Europe ceases to be quite so awkwardly dependent on the US, actually happen. And then MAGA goes the way of history. And we get an administration in the US that returns to fidelity to the US post-war mission of leading the free world and standing for democracy and not never-ending transactionalism with a sneer towards our allies. If that happens and the world has been improved, the world has been scared into improving by the demon Trump, America recovers. And so in a weird way, everyone's maybe better for it except for my 401k. The nightmare scenario is that this is going only in one direction, and that is down. And Vance wins the next election, or Trump machinates a third term, and there's civil war in the streets of America. America's much weakened. The Dow is down to 20,000. Putin has taken over Ukraine because America abandoned it, basically, and Europe failed to do something in time and is emboldened to go after Moldova, the Baltics, threaten Romania. Despots everywhere. You mentioned Aliyev in Azerbaijan before are encouraged to continue expansionism. Iran's happy, China's happy, having become clear that U.S. will not go to fight for Taiwan because they struck a deal with the Chinese over the semiconductor industry. China gobbles up Taiwan and becomes even more of a hegemon, casting a giant shadow over the entire Asian rim from Japan to the Philippines to even India. And it's a Hobbesian nightmare world in which the U.S. is in no way a good faith player that stands for an idealism that we always have stood for, despite our failures and despite the reason for cynicism about the U.S. It has stood for the idea, as Obama put it, that the arc bends towards justice and there are the better angels that we ultimately align with. All that is gone, and the U.S. is one more angry power in a multipolar world where the bad guys basically rule. It could really go either way.
All right, if people want more from you, especially the sunny upside version of that. So we've got your most recent piece leading the debate on Newsweek on the Department of Education. We have got your frequent appearances on Al Jazeera, on tell me the others.
News Nation in America, I-24 in Israel, Romanian TV as well, Indian TV sometimes.
And then, of course, the big one, check out the Substack, Ask Questions Later. Are you suggesting we should shoot first, Dan?
I actually think we should ask questions always.
Ask questions.
Title.
Yeah, okay, well, we'll keep workshopping that.
I'm being provocative, a little bit like Trump. If I can provoke people into just asking questions, my work is done.
Ask questions anytime. It's a little bit less of a ring to it. And your most recent one is when a journalist is mistakenly given war plans. That's fun because you are a veteran journalist. All right, Dan Perry, thanks so much.
Thank you, Matt.